My name is Captain Katie Harvey. I'm 27 years old and I serve in the United States Army. 30 minutes before I was supposed to get married, I stood frozen, watching my future mother-in-law, Margaret Wilson, set my wedding dress on fire. The dress I'd spent 6 months sewing by hand. The flame from her gold-plated Zippo lighter licked at the satin silk, turning the symbol of my love into a column of foul, black smoke. She dropped the lighter onto the polished hardwood floor, her face a mask of contempt. "I told Jason," she hissed, her voice as sharp as broken glass. "The Wilson family does not marry soldiers who are used to rolling around in the mud. Who do you think you are, bringing that cheap bronze medal in here and thinking it means anything? It's just a piece of metal, you little country girl. My daughter-in-law needs to know how to throw a gala, not how to clean a rifle." She believed she had won. But she had no idea that on the phone, propped discreetly on the vanity, a live stream to my unit in Germany had been running for the last 20 minutes. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments, hit that like button, and subscribe if you believe that honor is forged in fire, not bought with money. The first thing that registered wasn't the sight, but the smell. An acrid chemical stench that clawed at the back of my throat. The smell of something beautiful being violently unmade. My wedding dress, which had been hanging pristine from an ornate hook just moments before, was now engulfed in a hungry orange flame. The heat washed over my skin, a dry, blistering wave that made the air in the bridal suite shimmer. The fire didn't roar. It hissed, a venomous sound as it devoured 6 months of my life. Of late nights bent over a sewing machine, of careful stitches, and a belief in a future. My bridesmaids gasped, a chorus of sharp, horrified breaths that seemed to suck the remaining oxygen from the room. I heard their shock, their disbelief. But I didn't scream, I didn't cry. My body went still, but my mind went into overdrive, the years of training at West Point kicking in like a reflex. Threat assessment, one hostile, Margaret Wilson. Motive, elimination of perceived social contamination. Asset destroyed, wedding dress, handmade. Sentimental and monetary value high. Enemy intent, complete demoralization prior to main event. Psychological warfare, everything slowed down, the way it does in the moments before an ambush. The frantic gestures of my friends blurred at the edges of my vision. The only thing in sharp focus was Margaret's face. I cataloged every detail with cold precision. The triumphant curl of her lip, the manic gleam in her eyes, the slight tremor in her hand that betrayed the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She wasn't a grieving mother-in-law. She was an enemy combatant enjoying her victory. I wasn't watching a dress burn. I was witnessing a declaration of war. My old drill instructor at West Point used to scream it until his voice was raw. When you are under enemy fire, you do not panic. You analyze, you adapt, you overcome. Margaret let the silence hang for a moment, savoring the destruction. Then she launched her verbal assault, each word a carefully aimed bullet intended to shatter my self-worth. "Did you really think this was going to happen?" she began, her voice dripping with derision as she gestured at the smoldering remains of the dress. "That you could just waltz into this family, into this life? You don't belong here." She took a step closer, her diamond necklace catching the light, a stark contrast to the black ash beginning to drift through the air. She tapped a perfectly manicured finger against her collarbone. "This is worth more than every penny you'll ever earn in your little army career. Just like that cheap piece of jewelry you wear." Her eyes flickered to the bronze star I'd pinned to the inside of my bridal robe for good luck. My medal. The one I earned in Afghanistan, not for doing something extraordinary, but for doing my job while everything around us fell apart, for getting my people out. "It's not jewelry," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "Oh, of course not," she sneered. "It's a prop, a costume to make you feel important. Your father is a firefighter back in Columbus, isn't he? How admirable." The word was an insult. "But my son needs a wife who can sit on the board of the Cleveland Museum of Art, not someone whose idea of a fine dining is an MRE out of a plastic pouch. You don't understand our world. You are filth." "Filth?" The word landed, but it didn't break me. It clarified things. Throughout her tirade, my bridesmaids hadn't moved. My maid of honor, Sergeant Jessica Reyes, my sister-in-arms, stood ramrod straight. Her hands were clasped behind her back, her expression unreadable. The others followed her lead. They weren't frozen in fear, they were silent out of discipline. They were waiting for their commanding officer, me, to give an order. Their collective stillness was a wall of steel, an impenetrable fortress of loyalty that Margaret, in her arrogance, completely failed to comprehend. She was used to people cowering, to hired help and social climbers who would grovel at her feet. She mistook our discipline for submission. She saw my silence and thought she had broken my spirit. A small, cruel smile played on her lips. She believed the battle was over. It was a fatal miscalculation. "You're good at taking orders," she said, delivering what she thought was the final blow. "But you will never, ever give them in this house." That was it. That was the signal. I didn't answer her with words. There was nothing left to say. Instead, I moved. My actions were deliberate, stripped of any hesitation. 3 precise steps brought me to the marble-topped vanity table against the far wall. My hand reached out, fingers closing around the cool, smooth case of my cell phone. There was no shaking, no fumbling. Just the quiet efficiency of a soldier performing a familiar drill. I turned back to face her, the phone held firmly in my hand. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Even the hissing of the dying fire seemed to fade into the background. I finally met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw something in my eyes that wasn't shock or pain. It was control. My voice, when I spoke, was level. Not a single tremor of emotion betrayed the cold fury coiling in my gut. It wasn't the voice of a heartbroken bride. It was the voice of a captain informing the enemy that they had just walked, blindly and stupidly, into a minefield. "Mrs. Wilson," I said, my tone as flat and hard as a granite slab, "you have no idea what you've just done." As the color drained from Margaret's face, my mind flashed back. This wasn't a single, isolated attack. It was the culmination of a long, cold war she'd been waging against me from the very beginning. The fire in front of me was just the first time she'd used a literal match. For 2 years, she'd been trying to burn me down with words, with gestures, with a chilling contempt that was somehow more painful than open flame. The memories came rushing back, a series of invisible scars that now, in the smoky haze of the bridal suite, felt raw and exposed. It started with Thanksgiving. My first time visiting the Wilson family estate on the shores of Lake Erie. I was so nervous my hands were shaking as I drove up the winding, perfectly manicured driveway. I wanted so desperately to make a good impression, to show them I was more than just the soldier Jason had fallen in love with. I spent 2 days baking a pumpkin pie from my grandmother's recipe. The edges of the crust fluted perfectly, the aroma of cinnamon and nutmegs filling my tiny apartment. It was a piece of my home, a piece of my heart, offered up in a glass dish. I remember holding it out to Margaret in her cavernous, marble-floored foyer. She glanced at it, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes, before a tight, dismissive smile crossed her lips. She turned to her housekeeper, a woman in a crisp gray uniform. "Maria," she said, her voice light and airy, "take this to the kitchen. For the staff." Just like that, my offering was relegated to the help. A small, calculated act of cruelty designed to put me in my place before I'd even taken my coat off. The rest of the dinner was a masterclass in psychological exclusion. Margaret spoke endlessly of a Melissa Hammond, the daughter of a real estate tycoon. She recounted Melissa's recent charity trip to Monaco, her latest acquisition at a Sotheby's art auction, and her family's summer home in the Hamptons. Every anecdote was a carefully polished stone thrown in my direction, meant to highlight how small and insignificant my world was in comparison. I remember sitting there, my smile feeling stiff and unnatural, as I pushed mashed potatoes around on my plate. Underneath the table, Jason squeezed my hand, a silent apology. But the humiliation was a bitter pill that a loving gesture couldn't quite help me swallow. Then came Christmas. I had spent weeks searching for the perfect gift for Jason's father, Richard. I knew he was a history buff with a passion for military strategy. After countless hours online and in dusty old bookstores, I found it. A rare, first edition copy of a book on the Civil War, signed by the author. When I gave it to him on Christmas morning, his eyes lit up with genuine delight. He ran his hand over the worn leather cover with a reverence that made my heart swell. For a fleeting moment, I felt like I belonged. And then, Margaret's voice cut through the warm, festive air. "Oh, Richard, do we really have room for more dusty old things?" She turned to me, her smile as sharp as a shard of glass from a broken ornament. "Katie, dear, next time, a nice bottle of wine will do just fine. It's simpler, and far more suited to our standards." She had taken a moment of genuine connection and twisted it into a lesson on social class. The book, my thoughtful gift, was now just a dusty object, and I was the country mouse who didn't know any better. But the moment that truly carved itself into my memory happened a few months later. I had arrived early to pick up Jason and overheard his mother speaking to him in his father's study. Her voice was low but carried an intensity that made the hair on my arms stand up. "You are ruining your future, Jason," she said, her tone a venomous whisper. "What can that girl possibly offer you? A meager army salary and stories about life in a foxhole. You need a wife who can advance your career, who understands our world. Love doesn't pay the yacht club dues, Jason." An invisible fist slammed into my gut. In that moment, I understood with chilling clarity that in Margaret Wilson's eyes, I wasn't a person. I wasn't the woman her son loved. I was a liability, a bad investment, a line item on a balance sheet that didn't add up. After each of these moments, Jason was there. He would wrap his arms around me, his voice thick with shame and frustration. He would apologize for his mother, for her cruelty, for the world he came from. And he would make me a promise. "Once we're married, Katie, it will all be different," he'd say, his eyes pleading with me to believe him. "She'll have to accept you. You will be my family, my number one priority. I promise." I clung to that promise. I held on to it like a lifeline through every condescending remark, every dismissive gesture, every quiet humiliation. I endured because I believed in his love, and I believed that love would be enough to build a bridge over the chasm his mother had dug between us. It was that faith, that belief in his promise, that had given me the strength to stand here today, to put on the dress, and to walk towards a future with him. And if you've ever had to hold on to a promise or bite your tongue during a holiday dinner just to keep the peace, please support this story by hitting the like button. And if you feel comfortable, just type, "I understand," in the comments below. It helps more than you know. Standing in that room, the smell of burnt silk filling my lungs, I realized the full weight of my father's words echoing in my mind. He was a firefighter, a man who understood destruction better than anyone. "You can't choose the fires you have to face, Katie girl," he used to tell me. "But you can always choose how you walk into them and how you walk out." I had endured Margaret's small, insidious fires for 2 years, shielded by the promise of a future where I wouldn't have to fight anymore. But looking at the ashes of my dress, I understood. The war wasn't over. It had just begun. And this time, I wouldn't be using someone else's promise as a shield. I would be using my own. For a few seconds after I spoke, the room was suspended in a strange, taut silence. The air, thick with the smell of smoke and malice, seemed to crackle with unspoken energy. Margaret stared at me, her expression a mixture of defiance and confusion. She hadn't yet grasped the full meaning of my words, the shift in power that had just occurred. In that brief, silent standoff, my mind wasn't in the smoke-filled bridal suite anymore. It was somewhere colder, harsher, and far more real. I was back in the biting winter winds of upstate New York on the grounds of West Point. I felt the familiar ache in my bones, the ghost of a 50-pound rucksack digging into my shoulders. I remembered the forced marches through miles of frozen mud, my feet a massive blisters inside my boots, every muscle screaming in protest, yet my will refusing to buckle. I remembered the profound loneliness of being one of only a handful of women in my company, the constant unspoken pressure to work twice as hard, to be twice as tough, just to earn a baseline of respect. I remembered pushing my body and mind to the breaking point and then pushing further. Those years had been a crucible. They had stripped me down to my core and forged me into something new, something stronger. They had taught me that pain is temporary and that true strength isn't about how loudly you shout, but about how you hold the line when everything is trying to break you. Margaret Wilson and her petty, cruel little fire. She was nothing. She was a spoiled child playing with matches compared to the infernos I'd already walked through. My thoughts then shifted, softening as they turned to Jason. I saw his face, the earnest look in his eyes the weekend he drove 8 hours straight from Cleveland to Fort Drum, just to spend a few hours with me before turning around and driving back. I remembered him sitting on the floor of my barracks room, patiently learning how to field strip and clean my M4 rifle. Not because he had any interest in firearms, but because he wanted to understand my world, to hold a piece of it in his own hands. I remembered the long nights when I was deployed in Afghanistan, his voice a steady anchor over a crackling satellite phone as the distant thud of mortars echoed in the background. He never told me to be careful. He knew I would be. He just listened. His love was real. It was tangible and true, a steady beacon in the chaos. And it was for him, as much as for myself, that I knew I had to fight this battle. I wasn't just defending my own honor. I was fighting to pull him out from under the toxic shadow of the woman who thought love could be measured in yacht club dues. My gaze fell upon my bronze star, still pinned to my robe, glinting softly in the dim light. Margaret had called it a cheap piece of metal. To me, it was anything but. It wasn't a trophy. It was a testament. Looking at it, I didn't see polished bronze. I saw the faces of the soldiers in my unit. Young men and women who had trusted me with their lives in a place where one bad decision could mean the end of everything. I saw their sacrifice, their grit, their unwavering loyalty. That medal was a symbol of something Margaret would never understand: honor. It isn't something you can inherit or buy at an auction. It isn't displayed in a glass case. It's forged in quiet moments of integrity, in making the hard right choice over the easy wrong one when no one is watching. It's earned in sweat and fear, and an unwavering commitment to something bigger than yourself. West Point's motto was etched not just on the academy walls, but onto my very soul: duty, honor, country. They weren't just words, they were my compass. Setting fire to a wedding dress was a cowardly act. It was an act devoid of honor. And Captain Catherine Harvey does not retreat from cowardice. I thought of the day I got my acceptance letter to West Point. There was no fancy dinner, no champagne toast. My family celebrated in our small backyard in suburban Columbus with cheap beer and pepperoni pizza from a local joint. I remember my dad, a quiet man of few words, wrapping me in a hug, his firefighter's uniform still smelling faintly of smoke. He held me tight and whispered in my ear, his voice thick with emotion, "I have never been more proud." That simple, heartfelt pride from my working-class father was worth more than all the Wilson Steel money in the world. The contrast between that pure, unvarnished love and Margaret's venomous contempt solidified my resolve into something sharp and dangerous. All these thoughts, the grueling marches, Jason's steadfast love, my father's pride, the weight of my duty, converged in that single moment. My composure was no longer a defense mechanism. It was now a weapon. With a slow, deliberate movement, I turned the phone in my hand, angling the screen so Margaret could see it clearly. Her own face stared back at her, twisted in a mask of arrogant fury. The image was live, undeniable. Her eyes widened, the first flicker of genuine panic breaking through her carefully constructed facade. "The wedding live stream," I explained, my voice as calm and steady as if I were delivering a routine situation report. "For my unit stationed in Germany, and for Jason's family down in Florida who couldn't make it." I let the words hang in the air for a beat, each one a hammer blow against her crumbling fortress of privilege. It's been running for the last 20 minutes. The counteroffensive had officially begun. The mask of contempt on Margaret's face shattered. It happened in an instant, the smug superiority collapsing inward, replaced by a raw, primal panic. Her carefully curated composure dissolved into a gasping disbelief. You're lying," she stammered, her voice losing its sharp, aristocratic edge and becoming thin and reedy. "You wouldn't dare." But the proof was undeniable. From the small speaker of my phone, A wave of sound spilled into the room, dozens of voices murmuring in shock and outrage from halfway across the world. Then, one voice, clear and loud, cut through the noise, amplified by the phone's microphone. It was one of my sergeants in Germany. "Captain Harvey, we got your six. Bravo Company is right behind you." The sound of her soldiers, my soldiers, cheering in support was the breaking point. Like a cornered animal, Margaret lunged for the phone, her perfectly manicured nails outstretched like claws. She never made it. Sergeant Jessica Reyes moved with the fluid, economical grace of a trained soldier. She didn't touch Margaret. She simply stepped into her path, a calm, immovable object. "Ma'am," Jessica said, her voice devoid of emotion, yet carrying the unmistakable weight of authority. "I would advise against that. You have just committed destruction of property and verbal assault in front of several hundred military and civilian witnesses." Jessica's words were not a threat. They were a statement of fact, delivered with the chilling finality of a judge's gavel. Just then, on the live stream, the camera feed, which one of the bridesmaids had been holding, panned across the wedding guests. It settled for a moment on the groomsmen's area, where Jason stood. I saw his face. It was a thundercloud of disbelief hardening into pure, unadulterated fury. For a second he just stood there, his knuckles white as he clenched his fists. Then, without a word, he started to run. He didn't walk. He didn't jog. He ran. He sprinted through the perfectly arranged rows of white chairs, knocking over a stand of lilies with a crash that echoed through the stunned silence of the courtyard. Guests cried out his name in alarm, but he didn't hear them. He ran like a man charging into a combat zone to pull a fallen comrade from the line of fire. The door to the bridal suite burst open, slamming against the wall. Jason stood there, his chest heaving, his eyes wild. He didn't look at his mother. He didn't look at the smoking ruin of my dress. His eyes found mine, and in them, I saw a desperate plea for confirmation, for me to tell him that the horror he had just witnessed wasn't real. I just gave a single, slow nod. That was all it took. The anger in his face curdled into a deep, profound disappointment that was somehow more devastating to witness. He finally turned to his mother. "Mom," he said, his voice low and trembling with a rage I'd never heard from him before. "Tell me I did not just watch you set fire to the wedding dress of a decorated officer of the United States Army." While Jason confronted his mother, another drama was unfolding among the guests. Richard Wilson, a man I had only ever seen as the picture of stoic, corporate calm, sat in the front row as if he'd been struck by lightning. For a long moment, he was utterly still, his face pale with shock as he stared at the live stream on his own phone. But then, the shock gave way to something else. A quiet, cold resolve settled over his features. He rose to his feet with a new and unfamiliar purpose. He didn't shout. He didn't cause a scene. He walked calmly to a member of the hotel's security staff standing discreetly by the entrance and murmured something in his ear. His movements were precise, efficient, and final. He wasn't just managing a family crisis, he was a CEO performing damage control, excising a cancer from the board of his own dynasty. He had chosen his side. Back in the bridal suite, the tension was suffocating. Just as Margaret opened her mouth to offer some twisted justification, Richard Wilson walked into the room. His presence immediately commanded the space. He didn't even glance at his wife. His eyes, full of an apology so deep it needed no words, found mine. He walked straight to me, past his sputtering wife, past his furious son, and stood before me. "Captain Harvey," he said, his voice firm but laced with a profound sense of shame. "I am so very sorry. This will be handled." He took a breath, his gaze unwavering. "The wedding will still proceed, if that is what you wish." It was more than an apology. It was a decree. It was the official sanction from the patriarch of the Wilson clan. He had not only accepted me, he had sided with me against his own wife. That was all Jason needed. Emboldened by his father's support, he turned back to Margaret, his voice now stripped of its earlier tremor, leaving only the hard steel of finality. "You heard him, Mom," he said. "You are not welcome here anymore." The words hung in the air, absolute, and irrevocable. Margaret stared at him, her mouth agape, the full scope of her defeat finally crashing down upon her. She had gambled everything on the belief that her son's loyalty was to her name, her money, her world. She had lost. Her attack had not only failed to break me, it had incinerated the very foundation of her own power. In one fell swoop, she hadn't just lost a battle. She had lost her son, her husband, and her empire. In my officer training, they taught us about asymmetric warfare, about how a defeated enemy, once their primary assault has failed, will often resort to guerrilla tactics and psychological manipulation. They try to exploit your emotions, your loyalties, your sense of decency, twisting them into weapons to use against you. As the two large hotel security guards stepped into the room, their presence imposing and final, I watched Margaret Wilson execute that exact pivot. The defeated queen morphed into the tragic victim. Her rage vanished, replaced by a torrent of crocodile tears. Her posture, once rigid with arrogance, crumpled into a display of frail helplessness. She clutched at Jason's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "Jason, my baby, please don't do this to your mother," she sobbed, her voice artfully broken. "I was only trying to protect you. I only want what's best for you. Can't you see? This girl, she has you under some kind of spell." Her wild, tear-filled eyes then darted to Richard. "Richard, are you really going to let her do this? Let her tear our family apart?" Every word was a precisely calibrated weapon, aimed at the two oldest and deepest vulnerabilities a son and a husband can have: guilt and duty. For years, this had been her most effective arsenal. I could hear the whispers starting up from the guests who were now crowded near the doorway, drawn by the commotion. Their murmurs were laced with sympathy, not for me, but for the distraught mother being treated so harshly on her son's wedding day. I saw it then. Her final desperate gambit. To lose the battle but win the war of public opinion, painting herself as the martyr and me as the villain. I watched Jason's face. This was his final test. For years, I had seen him waver under this exact kind of emotional onslaught. I'd watched him try to appease her, to smooth things over, to compromise his own happiness for the sake of a fragile peace. A part of me held my breath, a cold knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. But the man standing before her now was not the same man who used to apologize for her behavior. The fire had forged him into something new too. He looked at his mother, and then he looked at me. When he spoke, his voice wasn't angry anymore. It was filled with an infinite, bone-deep weariness. With a gentleness that was somehow more final than any shout, he reached down and carefully unclasped her fingers from his arm. "That's enough, Mom," he said softly. He took a half step back, creating a small but significant space between them, and gestured toward me. "What's best for me is standing right here." His gaze returned to her, clear and unwavering. "You have had so many chances to accept her, to be a part of our life. But you chose to burn a bridge tonight. I am not going to let you burn anything else." Her performance faltered. His calm refusal to engage with her drama was like throwing water on her manufactured fire. It was a language she didn't understand. That's when Richard Wilson made his move. He stepped forward, physically placing himself between Margaret and us, a human shield of quiet, absolute authority. His expression was grim, his patience gone. He addressed the security guards first. "Please escort Mrs. Wilson to her car. Ensure she leaves the hotel premises immediately." The order was given with the crisp, impersonal authority of a CEO's firing a rogue executive. Then he turned to his wife. His voice was low, but it cut through the room like a surgeon's scalpel. "Margaret, we will discuss this at home. But today is my son's day." He paused, and then he did something that shifted the entire foundation of the Wilson family. He put a firm, steady hand on my shoulder. "And this young woman," he said, looking Margaret straight in the eye, "is my daughter now. If you ever touch her or speak to her like that again, you will answer to me." It wasn't a warning. It was a verdict. It was a public and irreversible transfer of power. The matriarch had been officially deposed. That was the blow that finally broke her. Denied by her son, dethroned by her husband, Margaret Wilson finally, truly, fell apart. The manufactured tears dried up, leaving behind an empty, hollowed-out expression of utter defeat. The fight was gone. All that remained was the vacant stare of someone who had just lost everything and knew it. As the security guards gently but firmly led her away, she had to pass by me. She stopped for a brief, chilling moment. She didn't say a word. She just looked at me, and her eyes were two black pits of pure, undiluted hatred. It was a look that promised this was not over, not really. The shadow had been banished from the room, but I knew its memory would linger. The door clicked shut behind her, plunging the room into a heavy silence. The immediate threat was gone, but the aftermath remained. The smell of smoke, the looks of shock on my friends' faces, the gaping hole in our schedule. We were a unit whose mission had been disrupted by hostile fire. For a moment, everyone just stood there, stunned, adrift in the chaos. I took a deep breath, the first calm, centering breath I'd taken in what felt like an eternity. I looked at the clock on the wall. The ceremony was supposed to have started 10 minutes ago. I pushed aside the lingering image of Margaret's hateful glare and stepped back into my role. Not as the bride, not as the victim, but as the one in charge. My voice cut cleanly through the silence, crisp and clear. "All right," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. "We have 20 minutes. Let's get to work." My words cut through the stunned silence, and the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The lingering shock and chaos evaporated, replaced by a surge of focused energy. I had just turned a bridal suite into an impromptu tactical operations center. Every person in that room, my bridesmaids, Jason, even Richard Wilson, snapped to attention, their eyes on me, waiting. The soldier in me took over completely. "All right, listen up," I said, my voice crisp and authoritative. The panic was gone. The hurt was compartmentalized. There was only the mission. Mission failure is not an option. The ceremony proceeds in 20 minutes. We need a new operations plan, and we need it now. I turned to Jason first. The look of awe on his face was something I'd tuck away to appreciate later. Right now, he was an asset. "Jason, you're on guest liaison. Get out there, find the wedding coordinator, and run interference. Tell them there's a minor wardrobe delay. Keep everyone calm. Project confidence." He nodded sharply, a flicker of his old, easygoing smile returning, now underpinned with a new respect. "Got it." He was gone before the word finished echoing. Next, I looked at Sergeant Reyes. "Jess, you're my XO on this. Get a sit rep from all bridesmaids. We need everyone calm, focused, and ready to execute. No panic. We hold the line." Jessica's expression was grimly professional, but I saw a fierce pride in her eyes. "Hoo-ah!" she barked, then immediately began murmuring orders to the other women, who instantly started checking their makeup, adjusting their dresses, readying themselves for the next phase. "What's Plan B, Katie?" One of my other bridesmaids, a sweet girl named Sarah, asked nervously, her eyes wide. "We don't have a dress." For the first time all day, a genuine, confident smile spread across my face. "There's always a Plan B," I said. My eyes found Melody, another bridesmaid who worked as a buyer for a high-end fashion boutique in downtown Cleveland. "Mel, you remember the designer, Michelle Keane? The one we met at the fundraiser for veterans housing?" Melody's eyes lit up with understanding. "Yes, of course." "Call her, now," I commanded. "Tell her Captain Harvey has a situation and is calling in a favor. Tell her we need a sample dress, size 4, ivory or white, clean, elegant, powerful. Tell her it's a matter of urgent operational importance. Go." Melody was already dialing her phone as she scrambled out the door. I was so focused on delegating that I almost didn't notice Richard Wilson watching me. He had been standing silently in the corner, observing the entire exchange with the keen, analytical eye of a man used to commanding boardrooms. He saw a problem being dismantled, a crisis being managed, a leader emerging from the smoke. He stepped forward. "Let me help," he said, his voice a low rumble of efficiency. He pulled out his own phone. "My driver will be at Ms. Keene's boutique in 10 minutes, he has clearance to bypass traffic." It wasn't a suggestion. It was the execution of a logistic solution. He understood the mission. He was now part of the team. While he was on the phone, a moment of quiet gratitude washed over me. I looked at the determined faces around me, each person moving with purpose, a well-oiled machine kicking into gear. And then Richard hung up his phone and walked over to me. He stood for a moment, just looking at me, his expression unreadable. "Your father," he said, his voice softer now, "must be a very proud man." Coming from him at this moment, the words landed with more weight than any medal. It was the acceptance I had stopped allowing myself to hope for, given freely and with respect. A lump formed in my throat, but I pushed it down. There was no time for tears. Jason returned, his part of the mission complete. "Coordinator is briefed. Guests think we're just running on bride time," he reported, a grin on his face. He came to stand beside me, not to take over, but to support. He didn't ask what was wrong or how I was feeling. He simply looked at me, his eyes shining with a love so profound it almost took my breath away, and asked the only question that mattered. "What's next, Captain?" Before I could answer, before everyone scattered to their assigned tasks, I turned back to my phone, which was still propped on the vanity, its small light indicating it was still live. I picked it up and looked directly into the lens. My voice was steady, imbued with a strength I drew from the people in the room and the ones watching from thousands of miles away. "To everyone watching, especially to Bravo Company," I said, my voice ringing with conviction. "Thank you for your patience. We've had a minor change in the operational timeline, but I assure you, the mission will be accomplished." I let a small, fierce smile touch my lips. Love and honor will always win, even when under enemy fire. And if you believe that a person's true character is revealed not when things are easy, but when they're under fire, hit that like button. Let's fill the comments with a simple "hooyah" to show support for everyone who refuses to back down. From the phone speaker, a thunderous roar erupted, the sound of my other family, my brothers and sisters in arms, cheering from their base in Germany. It was the sound of unwavering support, a tidal wave of loyalty washing over me. The cavalry had arrived, and we were ready to finish the fight. The 17 minutes it took for Richard's driver to return felt like the longest 17 minutes of my life. The controlled energy in the room had simmered into a tense, collective holding of breath. We had a plan. But a plan is just a theory until it's executed. A part of my mind, the cynical part forged in the deserts of Afghanistan, kept whispering, "What if it doesn't work? What if there's no dress?" I pushed the thought away, focusing on the steady ticking of the clock on the wall, each second a small hammer blow against my resolve. Then, a flurry of motion outside the door, and a man in a crisp suit, breathing heavily, burst in carrying a long white garment bag like it was a holy relic. The mission was a go. The collective sigh of relief in the room was a physical thing. Melody took the bag with the reverence it deserved and unzipped it. There was no rustle of lace, no shimmer of beaded satin. Instead, the material that emerged was a solid, substantial ivory crepe. It was a masterpiece of minimalist design, with clean lines, a strong silhouette, and an air of uncompromising elegance. It didn't whisper of fairy tales. It announced its presence with quiet authority. As Melody and Jess helped me into it, the cool, heavy fabric settled over my shoulders like a mantle of command. I looked at my reflection, and for the first time that day, I saw myself clearly. The girl who had painstakingly sewn a dress full of soft, hopeful dreams was gone, burned away in Margaret's fire. In her place stood this woman, reflected in the mirror. This dress wasn't for a princess. It was armor for a queen. It fit the person I had been forced to become in the last hour, and it felt more honest, more me, than the original ever could. While the other bridesmaids performed a whirlwind of touch-ups on my hair and makeup, Melody, with the skilled hands of a seasoned pro, made a few lightning-fast alterations with a needle and thread she'd produced from her purse. The entire room moved with the seamless efficiency of a pit crew, each person executing their role flawlessly. One of my bridesmaids still held the phone, the live stream broadcasting every focused, determined moment. I met her eyes in the mirror and nodded. Keep it rolling, I said, my voice steady. Let them see us march. When the doors to the bridal suite finally opened, the traditional wedding march began to play. My father, his firefighter's dress uniform immaculate, stood waiting for me. His face was a roadmap of pride, love, and unshed tears. He took my arm, his grip strong and steadying, a grip that had pulled people from fires and carried me on his shoulders as a child. "Ready, Captain," he murmured, his voice thick. "Ready, Dad," I whispered back, squeezing his arm. As we stepped out into the courtyard, an incredible thing happened. Jason, true to his word, had clearly briefed the guests. As one, every single person in attendance rose to their feet. But it wasn't the quiet, solemn reverence of a typical ceremony. A sound erupted from the crowd, a wall of sound, a tidal wave of thunderous applause that rolled through the courtyard and washed over me. It was a roar of approval, a standing ovation of defiance. They weren't just applauding a bride, they were applauding a fighter. They were clapping for my courage, for my resilience, for my refusal to be broken. I felt my father's hand tighten on mine, and when I glanced at him, I saw tears openly streaming down his weathered cheeks. As we began our walk down the aisle, my own vision blurring, I saw an elderly man in the second row. He was impeccably dressed, his chest adorned with a row of service ribbons from a long-past war. He stood ramrod straight and, slowly and deliberately, raised his hand to his brow in a crisp, military salute. He was a retired Army general, I realized with a jolt. A moment later, another man in the fourth row, a former Marine with a bulldog tattoo visible on his forearm, stood straighter and did the same. Then another, and another. All across the courtyard, the veterans and active duty service members in the audience, men and women, old and young, were saluting me. It was the highest honor they could bestow. A silent, powerful acknowledgement that transcended this wedding, this family drama. They were saluting one of their own, recognizing the uniform of the heart. The tears finally spilled over, but they were tears of overwhelming, cleansing gratitude. When I reached the altar, Jason took my hands in his. The love and pride in his eyes were so intense they felt like a physical force, holding me up, making me stronger. Our officiant, a retired Army chaplain with a kind, knowing face, set aside his prepared notes. He looked out at the guests, then at us. "We are gathered here today not just to witness a marriage," he began, his voice warm and resonant, "but to celebrate courage, to honor commitment. In the Army, we have a term for the person you trust with your life, the one who always has your back through chaos and fear. We call them a battle buddy. Today, Jason and Katie are choosing to be battle buddies for life, pledging to defend and support one another in times of peace and in times of conflict." When it was time for the vows, Jason turned to me, his hands enclosing mine, a warm, solid anchor. He didn't recite the traditional words. He spoke from his soul, his voice clear and strong, echoing the vows of a soldier. "Katie," he began, his gaze locked with mine, healing every wound Margaret had tried to inflict. "I promise to be your constant rear guard, to be your cover in every firefight, to be your comrade in every battle this life throws at us. I will never accept defeat. I will never quit. And I will never, ever leave a fallen comrade behind. My mission, starting today and for the rest of my life, is you." By the time he finished, I was crying freely, as was half the audience. Every word was a balm, a promise of a true and equal partnership. When the chaplain finally said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Jason didn't just kiss me. He pulled me into a fierce, grounding embrace, a hug that spoke of relief, of boundless love, and of a respect so profound it settled deep in my bones. It was a hug that said, "We made it. We're safe now." The applause that erupted was deafening, a joyous explosion of sound. And through the live stream, we could hear it, a tinny but triumphant roar of cheers from Bravo Company in Germany. This wasn't just the end of a ceremony. It was the declaration of a victory. We had faced enemy fire, together, and we had won. Walking into the reception hall felt like stepping from a battlefield into a victory celebration. The air, which had been thick with tension just an hour before, was now buzzing with a joyous, electric energy. As Jason and I were announced as husband and wife, The applause was even louder than it had been at the ceremony, a sustained, heartfelt roar of approval. But underneath the celebration, something fundamental had shifted. This was no longer just a wedding reception, it was an after-action review, and the results were being tallied in real time. As we made our way through the room, I noticed that nearly every guest was looking at their phone. The live stream hadn't just been watched, it had been weaponized. Short, powerful clips of Margaret setting the dress on fire, of her venomous tirade, of Jason's furious sprint, and of the veteran's salute had gone viral within our local community. A local news reporter, who had been invited as a guest, was already doing a live feed from a quiet corner of the room. The hashtags were everywhere. Captain Katie, wedding under fire, honor wins. What Margaret had intended as a private act of humiliation had become a very public referendum on her character, and the verdict was unanimous. The social landscape of the room had been completely redrawn. I watched as Margaret's inner circle, a clique of wealthy, formidable women who usually held court like a coven of queen bees, huddled together in a corner. They looked awkward, uncomfortable, their usual air of effortless superiority replaced by a palpable sense of unease. They had come expecting to witness the strategic merger of two powerful families. Instead, they had witnessed the self-immolation of their queen. One by one, I saw them make quiet, hasty exits, slipping out a side door without so much as a goodbye. They were rats deserting a sinking ship. The people who remained were our people. Jason's colleagues from his architecture firm, who looked at him with a newfound respect. My friends from home, their faces beaming with pride. And most noticeably, the veterans. They had formed their own unofficial honor guard around our table, a warm and welcoming battalion of shared values. The head table, which Margaret had meticulously planned to seat the old money titans of Cleveland, was now occupied by a retired firefighter, a decorated army captain, a proud architect, and a CEO who had just rediscovered his own moral compass. The social order Margaret had spent a lifetime building had crumbled to dust in a single afternoon. One of Margaret's closest friends, a woman named Beatrice Astor, whose face was a familiar sight on the society pages, made the mistake of trying to bridge the gap. She approached me with a practiced, sympathetic smile, her diamonds glittering. "Oh, Katie, my dear," she cooed, placing a cool hand on my arm. "Such a terribly unfortunate incident. Margaret just gets a bit overwrought sometimes." I looked down at her hand on my arm, then back up at her face. I gave her a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "In the Army, Mrs. Astor," I said, my voice pleasant but laced with ice, "we call what she did a hostile act, not being overwrought. But it was so lovely to meet you." The smile froze on her face. She withdrew her hand as if she'd been burned, stammered a quick, unintelligible reply, and beat a hasty retreat. The message was clear. The old rules no longer applied. I was not going to play their game of polite, passive-aggressive nonsense. Richard Wilson, however, was not acting like a man ashamed of his family's scandal. He was acting like a victorious general consolidating his position. He moved through the room with a renewed sense of purpose, not apologizing, but proudly introducing his new daughter. He'd bring a guest over, clap them on the back, and say with a booming voice, "Have you met my daughter, Captain Harvey, toughest damn person in this family?" He was publicly, unequivocally declaring his allegiance. Later, during the toasts, he stood up, glass in hand. He didn't rehash the day's events. He didn't need to. Everyone knew. Instead, he made a simple, powerful announcement. "To Jason and Katie," he said, raising his glass to us, "who have reminded us all today what truly matters." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And in that spirit, I am announcing tonight that the Wilson Family Foundation will be undergoing a major shift in its directional focus in the coming year." It was a quiet, corporate-sounding statement, but everyone in the room understood the subtext. The era of Margaret Wilson, with her vanity projects and social climbing charities, was officially over. But the most powerful testament to our victory wasn't in the toasts or the retreating backs of Margaret's friends. It was an idea born from the quick thinking of my bridesmaids. In place of a traditional guestbook, They had set up a large, beautifully framed corkboard with a banner across the top that read, Operation Enduring Love After Action Report. Guests didn't just sign their names or write cliched congratulations. They left messages of support, of admiration, of inspiration. The retired Marine with the bulldog tattoo wrote in bold Sharpie, Hurrah, Captain! You fought the good fight. Semper Fi. A young woman who worked with Jason wrote, Thank you for showing all of us that you never have to shrink yourself to fit into someone else's world. My favorite was a simple note scrawled on a cocktail napkin and pinned to the board. Honor runs deeper than money. Your dad must be proud. That board, filled with heartfelt messages of respect and solidarity, was worth more than all the expensive wedding gifts in the world. It was the ultimate proof that we had won not just a battle, but the war for what truly mattered. The celebration, as all intense operations do, eventually wound down. The band packed up, the last of the champagne was poured, and the grand ballroom slowly emptied out, leaving behind a comfortable quiet filled with our closest friends and family. The adrenaline of the day had faded, replaced by a warm, bone-deep exhaustion. It was the satisfying fatigue that comes after a hard-fought victory. We were surrounded by love and laughter, basking in the glow of our unconventional triumph. It was then that I saw Jason standing off to the side, his shoulders slumped slightly as he stared at his phone. The joyous light that had been in his eyes all evening had been replaced by a familiar shadow of sadness and fatigue. I walked over and gently touched his arm. He looked up, his smile not quite reaching his eyes, and showed me the screen. It was a long text message from his father. My eyes scanned the words. Richard had spoken with Margaret after she'd been escorted home. The text described a woman utterly broken, not, Richard noted with clinical precision, by remorse for her actions, but by the public demolition of her social standing. Her empire of influence had crumbled, and she was lost in the rubble. Richard had issued an ultimatum. She was to begin intensive psychological therapy immediately. It was her only path, he wrote, to any possible future relationship with her son. The final line was heavy with uncertainty. The future is in her hands now. Jason locked his phone and slid it into his pocket, the weight of it seeming to pull him down. Do you think, he asked, his voice barely a whisper, that we'll ever be able to forgive her? The question hung in the cool night air, heavy and complex. This was the aftershock, the part of the battle they don't show in the movies. Winning is one thing. Figuring out how to live in the crater left behind is another. Come with me, I said softly, taking his hand. I led him away from the lingering warmth of the reception hall, out through a set of French doors and into the hotel's quiet, manicured garden. The moon was high and bright, casting long shadows across the stone pathways. The air was cool and clean, a welcome contrast to the emotionally charged atmosphere we'd been in for hours. We found a stone bench tucked away in a small alcove, surrounded by the sweet scent of night-blooming jasmine. For a long moment, we just sat in silence, listening to the gentle murmur of a nearby fountain. Jason, I began, choosing my words with care. There's a prayer they teach you to lean on in tough times, the Serenity Prayer. It's about having the serenity to accept the things you cannot change, the courage to change the things you can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I looked at him, his face etched with conflict in the moonlight. I learned in the army that there's a big difference between forgiving someone and trusting them again. We can grant her our forgiveness, Jason. We can do it for ourselves so we aren't carrying around the weight of all that anger and bitterness. That's something we can change, our own hearts. I took his hand. But trust is different. Trust has to be earned back, one action at a time, over a very long time. And until it is, boundaries have to be established. That is the wisdom part. We can't just let her back into our lives as if nothing happened. There will have to be rules of engagement, new protocols. The balance of power has shifted, and she needs to understand that. He nodded slowly, a profound sense of relief seeming to wash over him. I wasn't demanding he cut his mother out of his life forever. I was offering a strategy, a way forward that protected us without demanding pure hatred. He was quiet for a moment, and then he reached into the inner pocket of his tuxedo jacket. He pulled out a small velvet-covered box. My heart skipped a beat, thinking it was another wedding gift. But when he opened it, my breath caught in my throat. Resting on the black velvet was my bronze star. He must have gone back to the bridal suite at some point, back to the ashes and the smoke, and found it. He had carefully cleaned away every speck of soot. The bronze gleamed, catching the moonlight. I found it on the floor, near the ashes of your robe, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He took it out of the box and pressed it into my palm. It was still warm from his body. My mother called this a cheap piece of metal. He closed my fingers around it, his own hands enveloping mine. To me, he said, looking me straight in the eye, this is the most precious piece of jewelry in the entire world. It represents who you are, and I have never been more proud to be your husband. In that moment, the last of the day's wounds closed over. The sting of Margaret's insult, the deepest cut she had managed to land, was finally, completely healed by the profound love and respect of this man. The validation from Richard, the support of my friends, the cheers of my unit, they had all been powerful. But this quiet act of recovery and reverence was everything. I didn't need Margaret's approval. I never had. I had all the honor, all the recognition, all the love I would ever need, right here in my hands. We stood up and walked to the edge of the garden, our arms around each other, looking out at the glittering skyline of Cleveland spread before us. We survived the first major engagement, Captain, Jason murmured into my hair, his tone light but his words heavy with meaning. I smiled, leaning my head against his shoulder, the cool metal of the medal a comforting weight in my hand. And we'll get through every other one that comes our way. Together, I said. Our command center is secure. We didn't talk about a honeymoon in the Maldives. We didn't talk about buying a house or any of the normal things a newly married couple might discuss. We just stood there, breathing in the quiet victory, knowing that we had built the foundation of our life together not on easy promises, but on something far stronger. Something that had been tested and proven true in the heart of the fire. 3 months later, I found myself standing in the grand ballroom of the same hotel. But the atmosphere was unrecognizable. It was the night of the Wilson Family Foundation's annual fundraising gala, an event that had once been the glittering centerpiece of Margaret's social calendar. In the past, it had been a showcase of empty opulence and performative charity. Tonight, it was something else entirely. The air wasn't filled with pretentious chatter, but with a quiet, purposeful dignity. I stood beside Jason and Richard, not as a guest, but as a newly appointed member of the Foundation's board. Richard stepped up to the podium, and the room fell silent. Behind him, a large screen lit up, not with the old stuffy Wilson family crest, but with a new logo. A stylized, elegant phoenix, its wings unfurled as it rose from a subtle flicker of flame. Good evening, Richard began, his voice steady and clear. Tonight marks a new beginning, a new mission. He spoke of honor, of service, and of the resilience of the human spirit. Then, with a proud glance in my direction, he announced the Foundation's new flagship initiative. We are proud to launch the Phoenix Project, he declared, a dedicated grant program to support female veterans and military families who are transitioning to civilian life, helping them start businesses, pursue education, and find stable housing. A wave of heartfelt applause filled the room. I looked at the logo on the screen, the beautiful bird rising from the fire, and a profound sense of peace settled over me. The very fire Margaret had lit to destroy my future had been captured, repurposed, and transformed into a beacon to light the way for others. The ashes of my wedding dress had become the seeds of a forest of new opportunities. Throughout the evening, people didn't approach me to gossip or to offer pitying glances. They came to connect. They saw me not as the victim in a viral video, but as a leader. A young woman who introduced herself as a recently discharged Air Force pilot came up to me, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Captain Harvey, she said, her voice trembling slightly. I've been trying to get a loan to start my own aviation consulting firm, and I've been hitting brick walls for 6 months. I was ready to give up. She took a deep breath. Watching what you did, how you stood your ground, it gave me the strength to make one more push. Thank you, Captain. You have no idea what your story meant to me. Her words were a gift, a confirmation that my personal battle had become something larger than myself. I had a new mission now, right here at home, using my own experiences not just to survive, but to help others lead. I listened to her story, offered what advice I could, and connected her with a contact Richard had introduced me to earlier that evening. I was no longer just a soldier. I was becoming a bridge. Later in the evening, as Jason and I were chatting with my father, a hotel staff member approached with a small cream-colored envelope on a silver tray. It was addressed to Jason. He opened it, his expression guarded. Inside was a simple, elegant card. There was no long, rambling apology, no attempt at manipulation. There were only 5 handwritten words. I have started the therapy. It wasn't a resolution. It wasn't a happy ending for that broken part of our family. But it was a beginning. A single, fragile flicker of hope in a long, dark tunnel. Jason quietly folded the card and put it in his pocket. He met my eyes and we shared a silent understanding. The road ahead with his mother would be long and uncertain, but we were no longer afraid of it. We had been tested and we knew the strength of our alliance. We could face whatever came next. As the gala wound down, Jason and I stepped out onto the same balcony where we had stood on our wedding night, looking out at the glittering expanse of the Cleveland skyline. The night was calm, the air cool against my skin. For a long time, we just stood there, shoulder to shoulder, breathing in the quiet peace. "Did you ever think," Jason murmured, his arm wrapping around my waist, "that one burnt dress could lead to all of this?" I smiled, leaning my head against his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. The image of the phoenix flashed in my mind, its wings tipped with gold. I thought of the ashes, of the hatred, and of the incredible resilient love that had risen from them. "The fire only burned away what was unnecessary," I said softly, my voice filled with a certainty that resonated deep in my soul. "The things that are truly built to last, the things forged from honor and loyalty and love, they don't burn." I turned to look at him, at my husband, my partner, my battle buddy. They just get stronger. The dress was gone, turned to ash and memory. But in its place, something far more beautiful and enduring had risen. A legacy of strength, a future of purpose, and a love as unbreakable and immortal as the phoenix itself. That night on the balcony, I realized my story wasn't about a wedding dress at all. It was about discovering that the strongest armor we can ever wear is the honor we earn and the love we fight for. Thank you for walking through the fire with me on this journey. My greatest hope is that it reminds you of your own strength. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing and joining our community. We believe every scar has a story, and every story has the power to heal. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters here. Until next time, stay strong.